Now, I'm going to be clear. I didn't and still don't really know anything about Star Wars in the 1990s. I watched the original 3 movies, sure, but to say I was a dedicated fan would be a little dishonest. I appreciated the filmmaking process, the amazing special effects, and the fun characters. But I wasn't really one for sci-fi adventure. Now, before you turn this video off and go watch something else, because Rebecca clearly doesn't know what she's talking about again, I'd like to hand over the reins to my brother, Tony, and his best friend, and Erica's younger brother, Elijah, 2 of the biggest Star Wars fans San Francisco has to offer.
Hey YouTube, I'm Tony.
And I'm Elijah.
And together, thanks to Rebecca reinventing our 12-year-old voices through the power of technology, we're going to give you the first-hand account of what it was like to be a Star Wars fan, especially a young Star Wars fan growing up in the 1990s.
You guys might have the idea in your heads that the 1990s was a real drought for Star Wars fans, that we had absolutely nothing to go on, and all we did was pine for the original trilogy. But that's so not true.
The 1990s was perhaps the last good decade of Star Wars content. Inventive, exciting, beautifully crafted, and keeping firmly to the established lore, but not so much that it felt unoriginal or repetitive.
Just because there hadn't been any movies since Return of the Jedi didn't mean no one was doing anything. There were games, comics, novels, pretty much every form of media expanded on George Lucas's intergalactic franchise in pretty much the best ways possible.
Sure, we had the Phantom Menace and the Special Edition releases at the end of the decade, but until that point, we could indulge our fantasies about Star Destroyers and Dark Lords and Jedis through page-turning books and thumb-bleedingly hard video games.
So come with us on this adventure into the decade of Star Wars time forgot, but should really remember, because there are a heck of a lot more gems hiding in the closet than you probably ever imagined.
In the 1990s, the original trilogy felt ancient and holy at the same time. We were both born in 1983, the same year as Return of the Jedi. So to that point, we had never seen A New Hope, Empire, or Jedi in a theater first.
We both saw them on VHS. Usually pan and scan, sometimes slightly warped. Always rewound carefully because rewinding cost money at the video store, and also because my parents would get mad if I didn't.
Me, personally, I tried to record Return of the Jedi off the TV one time, as Rebecca talked about in another video on VHS tapes, and the tape screwed up right at the part when Darth Vader was being unmasked at the end. I literally screamed.
You were heartbroken.
Like someone had smashed it with a hammer.
Anyway, on the West Coast, Star Wars movies were road trip movies. They played in minivans heading up Highway 5, on little built-in TVs, with headphones that only worked in one ear, while the other ear listened to the hum of tires on asphalt, and the occasional argument in the front seat.
They were what you watched at a friend's house while his parents grilled outside and forgot you existed. The screen glowing blue in a darkened living room that smelled like carpet and sunscreen. Everyone knew Darth Vader. Everyone knew Luke and Leia. The themes were baked into culture, quoted in commercials and referenced in jokes, but not everyone was a fan, and that made being one feel special.
Star Wars wasn't cool in the way skate videos were cool, or the way grunge bands were cool. It was older, quieter, something you either cared about deeply or didn't think about at all. And caring about it felt like joining a secret club with no meetings and no merchandise updates.
And for a long time, there were no new movies. That's the part people now don't really understand. There was a stretch where Star Wars didn't move. It didn't grow on screen. It just sat there, like a completed myth. The way Greek gods must feel when no one writes new stories about them anymore.
If you wanted more, you had to work for it. You had to dig through paperback racks at bookstores, flip through comic shops that smelled like dust and judgment, or beg your parents for PC games that came in giant cardboard boxes with manuals thicker than your math textbook.
Books were how the galaxy expanded first. Someone older than me handed me Heir to the Empire and said, "This is basically the sequel trilogy." Like they were passing me contraband. That sentence alone was enough to short-circuit my brain. The idea that Luke, Han, and Leia had lives after Return of the Jedi felt illegal, like peeking behind a curtain you weren't supposed to touch.
In that story, the Empire isn't gone at all, just bruised and angry, hiding in the shadows and regrouping. And then there was Thrawn, this blue-skinned guy who didn't act like any villain I'd ever seen. He didn't scream or throw tantrums or kill his own people for fun. He just studied his enemies, looked at their art, and figured out how to beat them by understanding how they thought. That scared us more than a lightsaber ever could.
Luke was still strong but unsure, clearly powerful, but still confused about what a Jedi was supposed to be now that there was no one left to teach him. Leia wasn't just blasting stormtroopers anymore. She was dealing with governments and arguments and responsibility, which somehow made her feel even tougher. Han was still sarcastic and reckless, but now he had more to lose, and you could feel that weight on him.
Reading it felt like watching a movie that somehow existed only in my head. And once we started, we forgot we were holding a book at all. We could see the Star Destroyers, hear the dialogue, and feel that Star Wars feeling kick back on like it had never left.
After that, it felt like the galaxy started stretching outward in every possible direction, like someone had taken the edges of the movies and pulled them apart. The Jedi Academy trilogy was a huge deal to us because it answered a question we didn't even realize we'd been asking.
Luke actually tries to rebuild the Jedi, not as a myth or a memory, but as a real place with classrooms and students on Yavin 4. Suddenly, Star Wars wasn't just about saving the galaxy once. It was about what came after.
The new students made everything feel fragile. Kip Duran especially stuck with me because he was powerful and angry and clearly hurting, and watching him fall to the dark side made being a Jedi feel dangerous in a way the movies never quite showed. You could do everything right and still mess up. Characters made bad choices and had to live with them. As a kid, that mattered to me a lot because it made the Force feel less like a superpower and more like a responsibility you could screw up.
Then there were the Young Jedi Knights books, which honestly felt like they were written directly for us. Jason and Jaina Solo weren't legends yet. They were kids who trained, complained, got scared, argued with friends, and still had to go on missions that were way bigger than they were ready for.
Their adventures felt like school mixed with Star Wars, with friendships, rivalries, crushes, and mistakes layered on top of lightsabers and space battles. We loved that they weren't perfect and didn't always know what to do. Reading those books made the galaxy feel reachable, like there was space in it for someone like me. It made us feel like if we somehow ended up in Star Wars, we wouldn't just be random people in the background running away from explosions. We could train, learn, and maybe matter a little.
What really saved everything for us were the comics, because the comics felt like Star Wars had gone underground and was only talking to the kids who were willing to look for it. They felt secret in a way the movies never did. You didn't stumble across them by accident while your mom was buying groceries. You had to go looking. You had to step into comic shops that smelled like dust, old paper, plastic sleeves, and a little bit of judgment.
You learned very quickly how to flip pages carefully, because if you bent a corner or handled something wrong, you'd get stared at by a guy who looked like he'd been alive when the Death Star exploded and was still mad about it.
The first Star Wars comics that really wrecked our brains were Dark Empire. And I mean that in the most loving way possible. I remember us lying on Tony's bed, opening one, and immediately thinking something was off. It didn't look like Star Wars was supposed to look, and that made it impossible to stop staring.
The art was full of shadows and strange colors, with faces that looked haunted and worlds that felt sick and dangerous. It was like someone had poured nightmares directly onto the page and called it canon. And the story itself felt insane in the best way.
The Emperor was back, and no, there was none of this somehow Palpatine returned crud from those awful Disney movies. Although, when you really think about it, clearly they were borrowing from somewhere. He wasn't a ghost or a rumor, but alive again in cloned bodies, ruling from this massive world devastator factory planet that felt way scarier than another Death Star, because it ate whole worlds instead of just blowing them up. Luke almost goes dark and joins him. Leia starts using the Force, which felt shocking and right at the same time.
Everything about it felt huge and risky and slightly forbidden, like Star Wars had grown teeth while no one was paying attention. We didn't even know you were allowed to tell stories like that with these characters. It made the galaxy feel bigger, older, and less safe, which somehow made it feel more real to us as kids who were just starting to realize stories didn't always have to be comforting.
Then there were Tales of the Jedi, which felt like opening a history book from a civilization that never existed, but somehow still had ruins.
These comics went thousands of years before the movies, long before the Knights of the Old Republic games. so far back that lightsabers and the Force felt raw and unfamiliar again. The Jedi and Sith didn't feel like copies of Luke and Vader. They felt like their own terrifying things, shaped by a different time.
The Sith weren't just bad guys in black capes anymore. They were empires, species, belief systems, whole cultures built around the dark side. Exar Kun and Ulic Qel-Droma felt tragic in a way I didn't yet have words for. Like heroes who made one bad choice and then kept walking down that path because turning back was too hard.
Reading those stories made us realize Star Wars wasn't just 3 movies we loved. It was a whole timeline, layered on itself like sand and stone, with forgotten ages buried underneath the parts everyone talked about.
Crimson Empire came later, and that one felt especially cool to like, partly because it focused on characters who barely did anything in the movies.
The Emperor's Red Guards had always just stood there, silent and unmoving like furniture. Suddenly, they were everything. Kir Kanos was this quiet, deadly survivor who felt more serious and disciplined than most Jedi, while Karnor Jax was pure betrayal, wrapped in red armor and ambition.
The idea that these guards had lives, friendships, rivalries, and loyalties after the Emperor died completely blew our minds. It made the fall of the Empire feel messier and more human. The whole thing also felt extremely 1990s, with sharp lines, dramatic poses, intense staring contests, and big action scenes that felt like they should have guitar riffs playing behind them. If Star Wars ever had a straight-up comic book action movie vibe, before comic book movies were everywhere, that was it.
The X-Wing comics were another favorite, especially because they made space battles feel personal instead of just cool. Wedge Antilles went from being that guy who survived everything to an actual character dealing with pressure, leadership, and the fear of losing pilots under his command.
The comics made flying feel dangerous and tactical, like every decision mattered and one mistake could get you killed. Ships broke, people didn't always come back, that mattered a lot, especially because at the same time the video games were doing something similar. And suddenly, Star Wars felt smart again. Not just flashy, it felt like a universe that cared about consequences.
And then, at the end of the decade, right as The Phantom Menace came out, the Star Wars canon threw a curveball with the introduction of the Yuuzhan Vong.
The first real time they arrived in the story was in the New Jedi Order, Vector Prime, which came out in 1999. And if you weren't paying attention, you might think, okay, new villains, whatever. Star Wars always has villains. But the Yuuzhan Vong didn't feel like new villains. They felt like a different genre broke into Star Wars when nobody was looking.
They were scary in a way the Empire wasn't. The Empire was terrifying, sure, but it was also familiar. Gray metal, stormtroopers, star destroyers, even their evil was organized, like evil with paperwork. The Yuuzhan Vong were like if someone took the rulebook of the galaxy and ripped it in half. They didn't worship machines. They hated them. They didn't build technology. They grew it. Their ships weren't ships. They were living things. Their weapons weren't blasters. They were creatures. Everything about them felt wet and sharp and wrong, like the galaxy had suddenly gotten infected.
And the worst part, the part that made us sit up straighter even as kids, was the idea that all the normal Star Wars advantages might not work. If you grow up on Star Wars, you learn these comforting equations. Jedi plus Force equals victory. Rebels plus courage equals hope. Even when things get bad, you assume the heroes have the right tools. The Yuuzhan Vong messed with that feeling.
They weren't just another warlord with a bigger gun. They were an outsider threat, something the Republic and the leftover Empire couldn't predict or intimidate the usual way. They were what happens when you've been arguing for decades about which side has the best starfighters, and then something shows up that doesn't care about starfighters at all because it brought its own nightmare biology instead.
Even their vibe was different. They made pain into a religion. They treated scars like trophies. They turned their bodies into battle projects. As a kid, you don't always have the words to describe why something freaks you out, but you know when your imagination starts misbehaving at night. The Yuuzhan Vong were that. They were compelling because they were terrifying. And they were terrifying because they didn't feel like they were playing the same game as everyone else.
What hit us hardest, reading about them while the world was still buzzing from the Phantom Menace, was realizing Star Wars could be hopeful and still have real stakes. The 1990s had trained us to treat the expanded universe like this endless expansion pack for our favorite stories. It was fun, it was cool, it made the galaxy bigger, but the Yuuzhan Vong made it feel like the galaxy could actually lose. Not in a temporary, we'll blow up the superweapon in the third act way. In a way that felt like a storm system moving in. The kind you can't stop by being brave at it.
And maybe that's why it worked so well for fans who'd spent the whole decade yearning. Because the 1990s weren't just about getting more Star Wars. They were about realizing Star Wars could change shape and still be Star Wars.
However, the closest we got to there being a fourth Star Wars movie before The Phantom Menace was Shadows of the Empire.
At the time, it didn't even feel like a game. It felt like a movie that had exploded and landed everywhere at once. There was a novel, comics, toys, trading cards, a soundtrack, posters, and then the Nintendo 64 game, which is the part that absolutely rewired my brain.
The idea alone was enough to make kids like us lose our minds. A Star Wars story set between The Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. That stretch of time felt sacred. Han was frozen. Luke was training. Vader was hunting. Nobody had touched that gap before, and suddenly someone was saying, actually, a lot happened here.
That felt illegal, like someone was opening a locked door in the timeline. And instead of playing as Luke or Han, you played as Dash Rendar, who was basically Han Solo if Han Solo had stayed single and decided to do side quests. Dash had his own ship, the Outrider, which looked just different enough from the Millennium Falcon to feel cool instead of fake. He had a droid named Lebo who talked a lot, and somehow that worked.
When the Nintendo 64 started showing up in living rooms in late 1996, Shadows of the Empire became a shared experience. Elijah would come over and the console would already be on, humming like it knew something important was about to happen.
The opening level on Hoth was the moment everyone talked about. Flying a snow speeder and wrapping tow cables around AT-AT legs didn't feel like playing a game. It felt like you'd stepped inside the movie. Even kids who didn't really care about Star Wars would stop and watch that part. It was proof that Star Wars wasn't just old movies anymore. It could move. It could react to you.
The game didn't stop there. You ran through Echo Base. You fought Wampus. You blasted stormtroopers. You rode swoop bikes through city streets so fast it felt like the controller might melt in your hands. You used a jetpack. You flew space battles. The camera was weird sometimes, and everyone complained about it, but nobody stopped playing.
The music alone made it feel enormous. It wasn't just recycled movie tracks. It had its own orchestral soundtrack, which felt incredibly serious. Like Star Wars trusted you with something important.
And it wasn't just a game. The book made it feel official. Reading about Prince Xizor, the Feline Crime Lord, who thought he could replace Darth Vader, felt dangerous. He wasn't a Sith. He wasn't a general. He was something worse. A politician with power who smiled while planning your death.
Leia being trapped in his palace on Coruscant made the galaxy feel huge and gross and alive. Luke building his new lightsaber felt like watching someone grow up in real time. And Dash dying, or maybe not dying, depending on how you finished the game, felt dramatic in that very 90s way where you wanted characters to be cool and mysterious and a little tragic.
The toys sealed it. Kenner figures of Dash Rendar and Prince Xizor showed up in stores like proof this was real. You could hold this story in your hand. Micro Machine sets recreated scenes that had never been in a movie, and nobody questioned it.
Shadows of the Empire didn't feel like a side story. It felt like the center of Star Wars for a while, especially on the West Coast where gaming culture and movie culture were already smashed together.
Speaking of video games, these things were huge if you had a PC or an N64.
Remember Super Star Wars on the Super Nintendo? That was brutally hard. Luke jumped like he was made of bricks, and enemies came from everywhere. But it didn't matter. You were inside the movie. You were on Tatooine. You were blasting stormtroopers. It didn't care if you were good. It cared that you were committed.
The follow-ups, Super Empire Strikes Back and Super Return of the Jedi, somehow got harder, which felt unfair but also kind of correct, because Star Wars was not supposed to be easy.
Then the PC games arrived, and that's when things got serious. X-Wing was the first time Star Wars felt smart. You didn't just fly and shoot. You had shields and power management and mission briefings that made you feel like an adult, even though you definitely were not one.
TIE Fighter made it even better by letting you play as the Empire, which felt illegal but amazing. Suddenly, the bad guys had rules and careers and pride. Flying for the Empire made Star Wars feel bigger, like the galaxy didn't care which side you personally liked.
Then Dark Forces came out and completely rewired our expectations. It was basically Doom, but Star Wars, and you played Kyle Katarn, who stole the Death Star plans before the movies even started.
That alone felt huge. The idea that there were important Star Wars stories happening just off-screen blew my mind. You fought stormtroopers, explored Imperial bases, and learned about Dark Troopers, which were the scariest thing imaginable at the time because they felt new and secret.
The best part, though, was Kyle Katarn himself. If you continued playing into the Jedi Outcast and Academy era, you found Kyle to be both a sarcastic smartass that you couldn't help but love, but he was also a dedicated Jedi, and his arc of balancing his passion and his duty to the Force, the New Republic, and the Jedi Order made him a character we really needed more of.
At the same time, the Dark Forces games, along with Outcast and Academy, brought some of the best side characters and villains ever assembled. How about design? That 8-foot reptile you had to try and fight on Artis with a blaster, only to find you had no chance of winning to begin with? Never in a Star Wars game had I felt so helpless, and it really annoyed me and wanted me to play more.
I liked Tavion. I thought she was hot. She kind of had this sultry ruggedness to her.
Elijah, keep your eye on the ball, please.
All right.
But getting back to the story, the real overarching question that modern Star Wars fans ask of those living in the 1990s. What were your predictions for any new Star Wars movies?
We knew for a while that Lucas was cooking something up, and the great thing was that we had front row seats since all of his work was being carried out in the Bay Area.
I remember us sitting in school during lunch asking ourselves the questions of what would come next. What would be official in the Star Wars timeline? Sanctioned by the big man himself.
In fact, we're such nerds that we actually wrote it down in notebooks, and we'd hypothesize our individual stories to gauge our reactions.
My idea back in the day was that the story would line up with episodes 4, 5, and 6. Obi-Wan would discover Anakin, not as a little kid, but maybe a late teen or early 20s. He's an exceptional pilot, really strong with the Force, and Obi-Wan trains him as a Jedi. Anakin is good at heart, but he's reckless and impulsive. He craves power because he wants to help people, but that craving is also his weakness. Somewhere along the line, he meets the Emperor, maybe in disguise, maybe in a direct confrontation, and the Emperor introduces him to dark side powers. At first, Anakin uses them for good deeds, helping people, but it's like an addictive drug. The more he uses them in his Jedi duties, the more he loses his morality and his judgment. Eventually, it consumes him, he turns to the dark side, and it ultimately costs him everything. That's how he becomes Darth Vader and helps the Emperor overthrow the Republic. As for how he became disfigured, I had a theory for that too. And that was basically because of the corruption of the dark side itself. You can see it in the Emperor. He's all twisted and disfigured, though I get that he was older than Vader. I imagined that the dark side just ate away at you over time. I sure didn't imagine Anakin being cut in half and falling into a volcano. That was pretty out there.
I'm not as imaginative as Tony, so my ideas were more expanding on the Star Wars setting during the time of the first 3 films. My opinion was that since they had a whole universe to play with, not only could they set stories hundreds of years in the past, or hundreds of years in the future, but in the existing timeline from completely different points of view, like everyday citizens trying to survive the Galactic Civil War, or even Imperials, who honestly believe they're justified in how the Empire runs the galaxy. The perspective of the Imperials was one that really held our curiosity way back when. Like, imagine a story written from the perspective of an ATST commander trying to keep that thing upright while fighting off the Ewoks.
I'm not gonna lie, I always thought the ATST was way cool. I so wanted one as a kid. I know they're completely impractical and would fall over the first pebble they encounter, but they were awesome and I love them!
After that little bit of fanboying from Tony, we really were of the conviction that with the right writers, they could have fueled movies and TV shows for decades, and that Shadows of the Empire and the many comic books and novels were just the beginning of a new golden age for Star Wars.
Then the Phantom Menace happened.
Oh, yeah.
and the Special Edition.
Don't remind me.
Yeah, by that stellar response, you can tell that Elijah and I didn't think much of the movies we got in the end. Not because they didn't meet our story expectations, but because they were just so underwhelming.
Let's start with the Special Edition movies. Like we said before, Tony and I had never seen a Star Wars movie in theaters, so the idea of getting to see one was the most amazing thing in the world for a pair of 14-year-olds.
So, after roping in Rebecca and Erica, we stood out in the cold January air for an hour and a half while waiting to see the re-release of A New Hope, holding our places in line to go use the bathroom or grab a coffee from a shop across the street.
It was pretty cold.
But finally, we went in, sat down, watched the movie, and left in complete confusion more than anger. I remember silently wondering, had I just watched a Star Wars movie? What was so special about the last 2 hours of our lives that it was worth the price of admission?
We went to get a coffee afterwards, none of us really knowing what to think, until my sister broke the deadlock with a crude but ultimately very true remark. She had a talent for making crudeness sound philosophical, and this was no exception. So, she turns to us and says that basically, that film was kind of like a birthday cake, good-looking, very tasty, nicely made, but for some reason, someone decided to put a dildo on top of it. It's obscene, it's unnecessary, it's not funny, even in an ironic sense, and it kind of ruins the experience of the rest of the cake.
Yeah, after we stopped laughing, her analogy did actually have a lot of truth to it. We'd definitely seen A New Hope, but why did there need to be all this CGI junk plastered over it? Like the bit with Jabba the Hutt. Aside from the fact that he just repeats what Greedo had said 30 seconds earlier, the CGI is alarmingly bad. Like, Jabba looks like he's made of dried toilet paper, and you can even see the stitching to get Harrison Ford to go over Jabba's tail. It's so bad.
Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi got off a little better. The part that ruins Empire for me is the inserting of clips showing Vader going from Cloud City to the Super Star Destroyer. I mean, yes, we get it. We know how Vader got from Cloud City to the Star Destroyer. He even said, "Bring my shuttle" in the original. We don't need to see it. We've got imaginations. It just breaks up the flow of the chase scene for no reason.
The thing that got us was when we found you couldn't get the original movies on home video anymore. They just seemed to disappear overnight. We've always made a point of keeping our original VHS tapes, and we even digitized them to computer a couple of years back so we can watch them whenever we want.
Yep, sometimes I still watch the movies with Tony, unblemished, not messed with, just movies that can age with grace. We'll keep them until we die. If someone broke into our houses and held us at gunpoint, we'd let them take everything except our Star Wars tapes.
What about the Phantom Menace?
Basically, the same reaction, though maybe a bit kinder.
Yeah, the CGI was a lot better than the special editions, but I remember Rebecca sitting next to me in the theater about halfway through, and she says, "Is it me, or is this movie not very good?" I had no argument. It was a mess.
Same. I went with my sisters Erica and Esme, and we all just thought this was really dumb and boring. It wasn't the worst movie we'd ever seen, but for all the hype, 16 years of waiting, our entire lives up to that point, and it just didn't feel like Star Wars at all.
Now, if you want people to point out the problems with the plot and how they should have stopped at page 1 and started over when reading the first draft, we suggest you watch Mr. Plinkett's dissection of the prequel trilogy. They're great videos and tons of fun.
As for why we, as 16-year-old dedicated Star Wars fans, didn't like The Phantom Menace when we first saw it, was simply because we had grown up on stories and media that seemed to be so much more sophisticated and intelligent in a way that matched the original trilogy. The Phantom Menace, meanwhile, was as subtle as a brick when it came to the fact that it was simply a cash grab, tapping into the extreme mentality while combining it with humor that suited a Ren and Stimpy or Rugrats episode more than a mainstream Star Wars release.
Like I said a moment ago, the CGI was, and still is, very impressive. But it can't hide the fact that this movie feels like they took a first draft and ran with it. The acting looks like it was done on the first take. No one has any humor or heart. The dialogue is so unbearably stiff and awkward that it makes you want to mute the film and enjoy the visuals only. As for the comedy, well, you know where most people stand.
The original trilogy had humorous moments, but they felt human and were carried more in what was said rather than what was done, with the exception of the Ewok battle at the end of Return of the Jedi. In this film, all of the humor rises or falls on Jar Jar Binks, and to say it falls would be an understatement. Surprisingly, he's the only character in these films that shows an emotion other than stone-faced blandness. But what he does just gets under your skin, and you can't help but sit there rolling your eyes and sighing whenever he's on screen.
Don't blame the actor, though, guys. Actors need a lot of help from the director and the writers, and if they don't have your back with a compelling script and performance hints, then you've got no chance.
Yeah, cut 'em some slack, you animals. We really don't blame any of the actors for the movies. We just blame the fact that not enough people said to George Lucas, what exactly are we making here? Don't get us wrong. We don't hate George Lucas for the prequels. But at the same time, we've never been the kind of people who, if we saw him in the street, would fall to our knees and worship him as our senpai.
Speaking of worship, we also had to endure those fanboys who came in banging plastic toys and screaming at the top of their voices every time someone got out a lightsaber.
Yeah, that drove me nuts. Constant noise from the back when we're just trying to watch the movie.
Anyway, after that, we did watch the other two prequel films in theaters simply out of curiosity more than anything else.
Attack of the Clones was a snorefest. I often forget that movie was ever made. And Revenge of the Sith only starts to come together in the last half hour when everyone stops talking and we get to indulge ourselves in an over-the-top, if not overlong, fight scene.
Agree. I haven't watched Attack of the Clones since it came out. And Revenge of the Sith, I'll watch maybe once or twice a decade, when I'm in the mood for sitting through wooden acting and an uninteresting story.
But yeah, why is the prequel trilogy so faceless and dark? Simply because these films were written to react to their time. The Phantom Menace was much more optimistic and over the top, because it was at the tail end of the 90s extreme thing, while the other two were really edgy because of that period right after 9/11, where everyone was craving that kind of stuff. Big, heavy shadows and plot lines that try to push the envelope without landing fully into hard R territory.
The original trilogy feels timeless because it actively worked against the current zeitgeist of hard-nosed police thrillers and Watergate conspiracy dramas, giving audiences some much-needed levity in a decade of near-constant hardship.
The prequels felt like they were bending far too much to what was cool or with it, and they feel exactly like what they are. Films made in the late 1990s and early 2000s, and unlike the originals, they have not aged with grace. Or at least, the originals would age with grace, if Lucas wouldn't stop messing around with them in post.
We will give this to the prequels. They did do a great job at expanding the Star Wars galaxy with new planets, worlds, and environments. Obviously, the original trilogy was limited by the technology of the time, but some of the worlds visited in the prequels are really cool. It's just a shame they appeared in such bland, uninteresting movies.
Since then, we're not interested anymore. We still appreciate Star Wars, but we really just don't care. All the controversy, all the fighting about The Last Jedi, the politically fueled arguments, and YouTube commentators telling you this and that.
We picked up the Disney Star Wars films at home, and each one was just disappointingly dull. Force Awakens was just a CGI remake of A New Hope. The Last Jedi barely made sense. And Rise of Skywalker felt like it was an unfinished movie.
We've never seen any of the shows. We've never played any of the video games. We're all just turned off to it. If people our age want to tear themselves apart over it, that's their problem. Us, we're just totally zoned out to it all.
So, looking back, was the 1990s the content desert everyone who wasn't alive back then says it is?
Nope. If anything, it was the busiest period of Star Wars history. Just because there were no new movies until 1999 didn't mean nothing was happening. If you were a truly dedicated fan, someone who got into the lore, loved the characters and settings, hunted for the undertones in the writing, and the subtle hints in the video game dialogue, you were living the life of Riley.
That's basically it. Everyone these days expects everything to be in a visual medium. But as kids who grew up in a time when books were still a thing, just barely hanging on, you could let your imagination do the heavy lifting fueled by the words on the page.
I think that's what I personally miss from the Star Wars of the 1990s. The imagination, the desire to do more with less and make it count. Which is why we're still of the opinion that Star Wars in the 1990s was not a wasteland for new stuff. It could be bold, cunning, interesting, exciting, and overall a great time for anyone who wanted more but had the patience to hunt it down and rely on their own mental imagery to fill in the gaps.
So that was our summary of Star Wars in the 90s.
Let us know what you think in the comments, or if you have your own memories.
Well, thanks, boys. I appreciate your time.
No
You're
problem.
welcome.
So what do you want to do now?
Let's go get a pizza. My treat.
Right on.
Wait!
the joy will bring. Tune into the beat, feel the magic, it's true. Channel 199 X, we're here just for you.